Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPAutos.com, Libertarian Car Guy. Apologies for the somewhat non-professional appearance of these videos. I'm not really a videographer. I'm a writer and sometimes a speaker, so that's what I'm more adept at, or at least hopefully I'm a little bit more adept at that than doing high quality videos. At any rate, what I wanted to talk about this morning, by the way, it's freezing here in Southwest Virginia, and I know I probably ought to light a fire, but I'm trying to conserve the firewood until it's really necessary. So anyway, that's why I'm wearing this and dressed up the way I am. But I wanted to talk briefly today about something that I've addressed before, but not really comprehensively, and that has to do with corporate average fuel economy, and that's the term for the federal government's fuel economy standards, as they put it, standards. You know, it's kind of a benign sounding term. It really is a mandate in that the federal government decrees that every vehicle manufacturer must achieve what they call a fleet average mileage number, and the fleet average is calculated by taking the mileage achieved by every model that they have and averaging that out. And if the average falls under what the federal government says it's arbitrarily got to be, the current standard is about 35 miles per gallon on average, then the manufacturer ends up getting socked with these gas guzzler fines. Notice the verbiage, you know, gas guzzler. It's a form of gas lighting, isn't it? They make it sound as if this is some sort of a horrible thing if you, for example, want or need a truck or an SUV or just a bigger vehicle, or if you want a performance vehicle and it guzzles gas, you know. And keeping in mind that you're paying for the gas, you're paying for the vehicle, and more fundamentally, you chose to buy that vehicle. Nobody's being forced to buy a quote-unquote gas guzzler, and that's really the sort of the hidden manipulation behind the use of that term, meaning that the government tries to make it seem as if it weren't mandating these arbitrary mandatory miles per gallon figures, that vehicle manufacturers would sell nothing other than so-called gas guzzling vehicles, and thus everybody would be at the mercy of the evil car companies and big oil. And it's ridiculous, it's fatuous, it's just silly. CAFE went into effect in the mid-1970s, and prior to that time, before there was CAFE, before the federal government got into that business, there were plenty of fuel-efficient cars. The distinction is that back then people had the choice to buy a fuel-efficient car, something like a Volkswagen Beetle, let's say. There were others that focused on being economical chiefly. And if they wanted, they could go out and buy a Cadillac Fleetwood, you know, with an 8-liter V8 that got 9 miles per gallon. If that floated their boat, if they liked it, that they were free to do that. Well, the busybodies in the government decided that every vehicle had to deliver high gas mileage. And what a lot of people don't understand is that that presents a kind of a paradox, because in order for a larger vehicle, even a mid-sized vehicle, let's say, let alone a truck or an SUV, to get high gas mileage, you have to resort to all sorts of engineering expedients to deliver the higher gas mileage, which increases the cost of the vehicle. So, for example, they'll put a hybrid drivetrain or a small engine with a turbocharger or some combination of that sort of thing, or gas direct injection, or transmissions with 8, 9, 10 speeds, things like that. The reason why vehicles have that now is because they allow for an incremental increase in gas mileage in a heavier vehicle. And you know, what's never talked about is the fact that these things have added considerably to the cost of vehicles. A V6 engine, especially a pushrod V6 engine or a pushrod V8 with, say, a 4-speed transmission with 1 overdrive gear, that's a relatively simple drivetrain. It doesn't cost a lot to manufacture it, and it doesn't cost a lot to sell it for that reason. And yeah, sure, it might not get 30 miles per gallon, it might get 20 miles per gallon, but you're saving a lot on the buy-in cost of the vehicle, and almost certainly you're going to save more down the road in terms of repair costs, which are fewer almost invariably when you have a simpler and less stressed drivetrain than when you have a more complex and stressed drivetrain, such as a turbocharged small engine that's constantly having to operate under boost, which is a form of pressure on all the internal surfaces. And that problem gets compounded in these small engines because small engines have smaller surfaces internally, things like bearings and so on, and the smaller surface has to absorb that heavier load as well as the heat. And there's so many synergistic problems with this, and it's one of the reasons why reliability and durability is decreasing now. You know, the trend is reversing. It used to be that cars were getting progressively better and better in the sense that they were more and more reliable, more and more durable, required less and less maintenance, and it became common for almost any car, if not completely abused, to last for 15, 20 years or even longer than that. That's actually going in the opposite direction now as a result of all of this. Now, I want to talk about the fundamental underlying issue here, which I think is the key thing, and I wish more people would talk about it, and it is why the federal government is even involved in this. The idea that the federal government should be decreeing how many miles per gallon your car gets is something that's both ridiculous and unconstitutional, at least if you believe in what the written Constitution actually says. Now, granted, there were no cars back in 1787. Nonetheless, the government at that time didn't envision anything like it. I mean, any plain reading of the document and its intentions makes that very, very clear. And yet now we have the federal government micromanaging something as ridiculous and petty as gas mileage. And there's no legitimate reason for it. There's no purpose to it. All it does, well, there is a purpose to it, but no good purpose. All it has done is make cars more expensive, made working on cars harder and more expensive, and deprived people of choice. And there's an additional paradox here too, in that the other regulations that the federal government involves itself in having to do with what they call safety, which is kind of disingenuous because it doesn't mean that they're making the cars safer to drive. What they are primarily doing via the regs is making cars more quote-unquote crash-worthy, meaning if you wreck, if you have an accident, then the car will probably be more survivable. You'll be less likely to be killed or injured because the car's heavier. The car has airbags, all of these things that make the car heavier and more expensive, but they also make cars less efficient, less fuel efficient. You look at even current small cars, cars like, say, a Honda Civic or a Toyota Prius for that matter, and most of these things are pushing 3,000 pounds now. That used to be how much a mid-sized sedan weighed at one time, and mid-sized sedans now are nearly 2 tons, 4,000 pounds, I should say. And obviously, it's difficult to get better gas mileage out of a heavy vehicle. You know, back in the 70s when CAFE first came online, everybody was deriding the quote-unquote gas hogs, and they were particularly talking about big American cars, body-on-frame construction, V8 engines, and rear-wheel drive. Those are the horrible gas hogs. But it's interesting to me that if you go back and look at the stats of those vehicles, they actually weren't that heavy. You know, for example, I mean, I've got an old muscle car. I've got a 76 Pontiac Trans Am out in the garage. And even though it has a bolt-on frame that holds the engine, the front suspension, and the huge cast iron V8 engine, and even though it has a solid cast iron rear axle, leaf springs, coil springs, has heavy gauge steel panels, the thing only weighs about 3,800 pounds, and that makes it a comparative lightweight in today's vehicle marketplace. EVs, by the way, are even worse. Most EVs now are in the 3-ton range. Not kidding, 7,000, 8,000 pounds. Look at how much something like a Rivian weighs, or a Hummer EV, or the Cadillac IQ. It's just completely perplexed and out of hand, and everything's totally distorted as a result. I'd like to see the government get entirely out of the business of decreeing fuel economy as well as safety. And if that were to happen, we might actually have latter-day versions of cars like, if you're old enough to remember the 80s and the early 90s, Honda used to make a car called the CRX, and there's an HF version of it that got 55 miles per gallon. And that was with a carburetor that was, you know, without any of the elaborate gas direct injection hybrid technology that you see today, because it was light, and so it didn't need a big engine. Now today, we have even lighter weight materials, and we have manufacturing processes that could lower the weight of a vehicle even more, and engines are more efficient than they were, and it would be very feasible from a technical point of view to have small light cars that were capable of averaging 60, 65, even 70 miles per gallon without hybrid drivetrains. And wouldn't that be great? And the cherry on top of that sundae would be that they'd be inexpensive. We could probably have cars like that for around $15,000 or so if the federal government weren't mandating via these regulations and via compliance all of these things that new vehicles have to have, and so the manufacturers have to figure out a way to have them in their vehicles. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit today, and now I'm going to go get some firewood and try to warm up before I lose control of the rest of my body. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch up with you again soon.